So today we're jumping back into our discussion of the history of hell in the Christian faith because, oh baby, hell as a concept has a long history whose meaning has changed a lot over time. And since this is video 3 and we've set the ground rules in the prior 2 videos, we're just going to crack on. And remember, this series isn't about disproving the existence of hell, proving the existence of hell, or anything like that. So if you're looking for a turn and burn, you won't find that here. And today we're going to talk about a word in the Old Testament that no major modern translations, with the exception of one, but that one translation is a doozy, still translate as hell. And that is Sheol. And oh yeah, my name's Ken. I'm a full-time Jesus-loving non-traditional missionary that's been abroad for 5 years. I'm also a researcher and teacher that seriously digs history, especially ancient religious history, and I teach classes online too. You should check them out in my profile. So, let's talk about Sheol, baby. Let's talk about you and me. Let's talk about all the sleeping and the resting that may be. I gotta keep it real for my 90s and double aughts kids. Can't stop, won't stop. But in the Old Testament, a word that some Bibles translate as hell doesn't really mean what we think of when we think of the word hell. And this word is Sheol. The Hebrew word Sheol is used in the Old Testament around 65, 66 times depending on translation. And the King James, along with the New King James, is the only major translation that still translates Sheol as hell in the Old Testament. Every other major modern translation has moved to a more accurate rendering of the original text, replacing mentions of hell in the Old Testament with the appropriate source word. This isn't a progressive thing. It's not a postmodern thing. This is presenting a more accurate translation based upon available ancient texts. But since most folks in the States are more familiar with the King James, I'll mention that the KJV translates Sheol as grave 31 times, hell 31 times, and pit 3 times. Again, however, ancient texts and modern widely used translations do not translate Sheol as hell in the Old Testament, and I will say it again and again. And the Hebrew Bible does not translate Sheol as hell either. Instead of a fiery furnace, which is what we typically think of when we hear the word hell, Sheol refers to the grave, or the domain of the dead. And while the concept of Sheol changes a bit throughout the Old Testament, especially as we get closer to the Hellenistic and intertestamental periods, in a nutshell, in the afterlife, Sheol was the place where, after death, all souls went. Every soul, according to Psalm 49. And that means both good and bad, righteous and unrighteous, according to Ecclesiastes 9. Sheol was situated in the bowels of the earth, according to Deuteronomy 32, 1 Samuel 28, Job 26, Psalm 86, Isaiah 7, and Ezekiel 31. And Sheol was your destiny. It's where you were going, no questions asked, and that's Psalm 49 and 89. Now remember what I said in the last video. When you're looking at biblical texts, which I do personally believe are divinely inspired, you're looking at a collection of works from different time periods, cultural understandings, and people groups. So that means there were different ideas of what Sheol actually was. We make a grave mistake. Get it? Grave, Sheol. I'll stop. When we think that ancient peoples believed the same exact things we do, and that these beliefs followed a linear path from thousands of years ago to the present day. The religion and beliefs of the ancient Israelites and those of ancient Judaism was actually quite different, just as the early Judaic beliefs of those in the exilic period were different than that of those under a more Hellenistic influence during Jesus' day. And in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, it's obvious that the concept of Sheol changed, or at least the ancients' understanding of Sheol changed. In earliest forms, it appears that there's much in common with the Hebraic idea of Sheol and the afterlife of other Mesopotamian cultures. And like the other ancient cultures, Israelites believed in keeping the graves of families and tribes together. So the use of Sheol infers that it was the common grave of all humanity, like a big family tomb of mankind deep in the earth. And at least early on, one thing that was great about the afterlife in Sheol was that there was no hate, anger, or work. But the bad thing is that there's no love, knowledge, or wisdom, and that's Ecclesiastes 9. There's no sound either, according to Psalm 94 and 115, which also means there's no worship of God, and that's Psalm 6, 30, 88, and 115, and Isaiah 38. Job 10, Job 17, Psalm 88, and 143 say there's no light in Sheol. There's also no memories in Sheol, according to Psalm 6, 88, and Ecclesiastes 9. And in its earliest form, Sheol isn't even used as a place of punishment after death. Psalm 6, Isaiah 38, and Ecclesiastes 9, in fact, speak of it as a realm of unconsciousness, of sleeping. of resting with your family. And some biblical writers even believe that the inhabitants of Sheol could, under some circumstances, be summoned by the living, as when the witch of Endor calls up the spirit of Samuel for Saul. And while it wasn't a pleasurable idea to go to Sheol, sometimes it was considered a better state than life, like in Job 14 or in Genesis 37. Now, some biblical writers assume the dead were separated from God, like in Psalm 88 and Isaiah 38, but others believe that God's presence was even in Sheol, as in Psalm 139. And Moses said that God's anger burns like a flame in the deepest, darkest places of Sheol. But visually, Sheol's denizens were mentioned as weak, incorporeal, trembling shades in Job 26, Psalm 88, Isaiah 14. And the realm of Sheol is darkness, shadows, and dust. And Sheol is personified as a voracious and ravenous beast that swallows the living. That's Proverbs 1:27 and Isaiah 5, of which there's no escape. Well, at least until later writers of Isaiah 25 and 26 and Daniel 12, where the writer of Isaiah says that God will one day swallow up death and there will be a resurrection of the dead, and the last verses of Isaiah 66 and the writer of Daniel stating that the faithful will be rewarded with everlasting life, while the rest will experience eternal contempt. Now, that shift is very important, especially if you ascribe to the scholarly consensus of this portion of Isaiah 25 and 26, reaching its final form in the 6th to 5th century BC, Isaiah 66 in the 5th century, and the evidence that Daniel was written in the 2nd century about a 6th century event. Because what we're seeing is that there's a major shift concerning what actually goes on down in Sheol, especially after the return of the Jewish priesthood from exile and the establishment of Jerusalem as the center of the Jewish faith. And soon this afterlife concept, where Sheol is just a place that you go and you die, begins to really develop a lot of depth, with those ruled by conceit and the unjust, the improperly buried, those that are unclean, endure pure misery in Sheol, lamenting their faith, while those who die in God's graces are reunited with their families in Sheol, aka the bosom of Abraham. And that's reflected and taken a step further in the apocryphal book of Maccabees, this belief of Jewish martyrs who died, expecting that after our death in this fashion, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will receive us, and all of our forefathers will praise us. And that's in 4 Maccabees 13. And as time went on during this intertestamental period, various Jewish apocalyptic pieces of literature really began to expound on this concept of afterlife, even taking readers on a journey of what lies beyond, which we'll talk about in the next video when we dive into the biblical concept of Hades. So as you see, when it comes to Sheol, it sure as heck doesn't fit the picture of what we typically think of as hell. And in fact, we see that there wasn't agreement between writers as to what Sheol actually was. Some believed it was a metaphor or something to be personified. Some believed it was an actual very real place. And there are even extra biblical mentions that Sheol actually was a huge bone of contention between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, aka the Jewish priesthood, who disagreed on resurrection and the afterlife itself. So, that's Sheol in the Old Testament. And next video, we're going to turn our attention to this idea of Hades, which begins to pop up and really takes main stage during the intertestamental period and with the early New Testament writers. So stay tuned and follow for more.